Okay, so you want to own a data center. Find a piece of land, fill it with servers, watch the cloud revenue roll in. That's the plan in your head. And honestly, it's not a crazy one. Drive past one of these buildings on the highway. No windows, no signs, no people. And it looks like the simplest business in the world. A giant concrete box that just sits there and prints money while the internet runs through it. You watch that scene and you think, how hard could this actually be? Here's the thing. You're looking at the finished product of a process so strange, so deliberately hidden, and so expensive before a single server ever powers on that most people who try to enter this industry get stopped in the very first step, not by money, not by technology, but by something they never even thought to prepare for. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why the most powerful companies on Earth go to extraordinary lengths to make sure nobody knows they're the ones building these things. This video is about what it actually costs in money, in time, and in legal architecture to own a data center. Not the glossy version, the real version. The one the industry doesn't talk about on panels. I've been deep in the weeds on how these facilities actually get built, and what I found is that the gap between what people assume and what actually happens is genuinely one of the wildest stories in infrastructure right now. We're going to go through 3 layers of this. How you actually acquire the land, what happens when you try to get power, and then the water situation, which is where this whole thing gets truly strange. And I'll warn you now, the water piece at the end is the part that almost nobody covers, and it changes how you see everything that came before it. Let's start with the land, because this is where the naive version of the plan falls apart immediately. You picture it simply enough. You find a plot of land in a good location, somewhere with fiber access, near a power grid, maybe outside a major metro. You put in an offer, you close the deal, you start building. That's how real estate works. Except that's not how this works at all. Hyperscalers routinely hide behind shell companies with code names to negotiate permits and development agreements with local officials under NDAs, a practice they defend as a way to prevent inflated land prices. So the first thing you actually do when you want to buy land for a data center is you create a fake company with a fake name, and that fake company is the one that makes the offer. This is not a fringe tactic. One of Meta's subsidiaries, a little-known LLC called Laidley, was the entity behind what local documents called Project Sucra, a code name for what Mark Zuckerberg now calls Hyperion, a massive AI data center he says will be so large it would cover a significant part of Manhattan. The local officials who approved it were voting on a project they knew almost nothing about. In several documented cases, one shell LLC buys the land, and a second, completely unrelated-looking shell LLC is the one that develops it. And the only reason anyone ever figured out they were connected is because paperwork occasionally slips up and lists both LLCs at the same address. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just how the acquisition process is structured. So before you've broken a single piece of ground, you've already built a small legal architecture just to buy dirt, and that's the easy part. One of the most important shifts in data center real estate is timing. Hyperscalers are acquiring and entitling land years before vertical construction becomes visible. The reason is power. And this is where step 2 gets genuinely brutal. Here's what most people picture when they think about a data center's electricity situation. You build the building. You call the utility. They run a line. You get a bill every month. That mental model is so far from reality, it's almost funny. The actual process of securing power capacity for a large data center can take anywhere from 12 to 36 months before construction even starts because of equipment backlogs, transmission upgrade requirements, and a transformer shortage that has now become one of the defining constraints of the entire industry. Typical lead times for large power transformers run 3 to 5 years. Medium voltage switchgear has multi-year backlogs and is effectively sold out through 2028 in many channels. Think about what that means practically. Data center transformer procurement is now one of the earliest go/no-go questions in development. A site can have land control, zoning support, and tenant demand, but still fail if the electrical equipment timeline doesn't match the energization date. So you're not just waiting on a utility to flip a switch. You're competing in a global queue for physical hardware that doesn't exist yet, and you're doing that before you've poured a single foundation. And then there's how you actually pay for that power. The contracts that lock in electricity capacity for large facilities are called power purchase agreements, or PPAs. In January 2026, Meta entered into a 20-year power purchase agreement with Vistra, securing over 2,600 megawatts of zero-carbon energy from nuclear plants, 20 years. These deals now typically use what's called a take-or-pay structure, meaning the utility gets paid whether you use the power or not. So your electric bill is not a monthly variable cost you can manage. It is a multi-year, non-cancelable financial commitment that you sign before construction starts, before you have a single tenant, before you've even ordered the servers. You are committing to pay for electricity you haven't used yet, from a building you haven't built yet, on land you bought under a fake company name. Industry estimates suggest 30 to 50% of planned 2026 data center openings will be delayed or canceled, with only around 5 gigawatts under construction out of roughly 16 gigawatts announced. That's not a demand problem. The demand is obviously there. That's an infrastructure problem, a physical bottleneck in the supply chain for the hardware that connects buildings to the grid. Engineering, procurement, and construction firms report being forced to redesign schedules, reorder work sequences, and lock in equipment earlier than ever, because access to scarce grid components increasingly determines which projects can advance and which are pushed into multi-year limbo. So now you've got fake company land, a power contract you're paying for regardless of what happens, and a construction timeline that depends on transformer availability. You're probably 2 to 3 years in before the building is operational. And you haven't gotten to the strangest part yet. I mentioned at the top that there's something about how these facilities operate that almost nobody covers, and it changes how you see everything else. We're about halfway through, so let me plant the flag. It's the water. And the reason it matters isn't what you think. First, the basic reality. A mid-sized data center can use about 300,000 gallons of water per day, roughly equivalent to the daily water use of 1,000 homes. Larger data centers can use up to 5 million gallons per day, or about 1.8 billion gallons annually, a usage equivalent to a town of 10,000 to 50,000 people. That water is almost entirely for cooling. The servers generate enormous heat, and evaporative cooling is one of the cheapest and most effective ways to manage it. Water absorbs heat, water vapor escapes, and you need a constant fresh supply to replace what's lost. Now here's where it gets strange. Water consumption data is something most hyperscalers don't disclose for each location they operate in. And that information gap is particularly concerning for projects proposed in water-stressed regions. We're not talking about rough estimates being unavailable. We're talking about a situation where, in drought-stricken Tucson, Arizona, Amazon Web Services and a developer spent nearly 2 years negotiating a $3.6 billion, 290-acre data center campus behind NDAs, keeping the public in the dark about projected water usage. The people whose water supply would be affected by this facility had no legal right to know how much of it the facility planned to use. Over 40% of planned and existing U.S. data centers are located in areas classified as having high or extremely high water scarcity. And in most of those places, the communities drawing from the same water sources as these facilities are legally barred from knowing the consumption numbers, even after the facility is already open and operating. The NDAs that govern these projects are structured in ways that go further than most people realize. Some of them prohibit disclosure of the existence of the NDA itself, meaning you're not just barred from knowing the details, you're barred from knowing that a secrecy agreement exists in the first place. In Virginia, home to the world's largest concentration of data centers, 80% of localities with proposed or existing data centers have NDAs in place. While electricity demand could triple in the state by 2050, these secrecy agreements are shutting the public out of decisions that could shape their rates for decades. And it goes one layer deeper than that. Sometimes the elected officials who are expected to vote on whether to approve one of these projects are themselves bound by ND, as that prevent them from seeing the actual numbers they're supposed to be evaluating. Think about that for a second. A city council member is asked to vote yes or no on a project with multi-billion-dollar infrastructure implications for their community's water supply, and they are legally prevented from knowing how much water the project will use. In Memphis, Elon Musk's company, XAI, locked government officials behind NDAs to conceal details of the Colossus data centers. Residents learned of the project weeks before it began operating. Now you might assume this is purely a PR problem, that companies are hiding water numbers because the numbers look bad, and that's partly true. But there's a second reason that is genuinely obscure, and it reframes the entire secrecy question. Cooling load is a proxy for server count. The amount of water a data center uses tells you, roughly, how much heat it's generating. How much heat it's generating tells you roughly how many servers are running. And how many servers are running tells a competitor a lot about your reserve computing capacity, how much headroom you have, how fast you're scaling, where your bottlenecks are. Reporting suggests Google keeps water usage secret, partly because the cooling load gives away roughly how many servers are in the building, and hyperscalers don't want competitors estimating their infrastructure position. So what looks like an environmental PR fight is actually, at least in part, a competitive intelligence war. The water numbers are trade secrets not because of optics, but because they're a map of the inside of the building. In 2025, lawmakers in at least 9 states introduced bills requiring disclosure of projected or actual water consumption to local suppliers or state agencies. But taken together, these developments reflect a persistent tension. While pressure for greater transparency continues to build, many states remain cautious about adopting requirements perceived as undermining their competitiveness in attracting data center investment. In other words, the states that most need the transparency are often the ones most reluctant to require it, because they want the economic activity the facilities bring. In New Jersey and California, bills requiring data center water use reporting passed both legislative chambers, but were vetoed by Democratic governors. In California, Governor Newsom vetoed legislation that would have required data center operators to share site-level water use estimates and annual consumption reports with local water suppliers. The industry lobbied hard against it, and it worked. There's also an unresolved legal fight happening right now over whether a building's water and power draw should be classified as a trade secret, legally protected corporate intellectual property that competitors and the public have no right to see. Operators in several states have successfully made that argument, meaning something as basic as how much electricity does this building use is, in some jurisdictions, treated the same way as a proprietary algorithm or a product formula, a building's utility bill, protected as IP. One more thing worth knowing, and this one is genuinely strange in a way that's hard to categorize. There are documented examples of retired military officials being deployed publicly to defend these projects in drought-affected communities, lending their credibility to arguments about water secrecy, using the authority of their service record to make the case that the public doesn't need to know the numbers. It's a PR tactic that only exists because the normal arguments aren't landing with local residents who are watching their wells dry up. There's also an unverified but widely reported claim, sourced from an internal leak, that one major cloud provider consumed roughly 105 billion gallons of water in a single year, but publicly disclosed only a fraction of that under a water-positive marketing campaign. The debate internally, allegedly, was over whether to even count the water used to generate the electricity the data center consumes, what's called secondary water use. That claim is contested and comes from a single leaked source, so treated accordingly. But the fact that the debate apparently existed at all tells you something about how these numbers get constructed in the first place. If you're watching this and thinking about the data center industry, whether as an investor, a developer, a policy person, or just someone trying to understand where AI infrastructure actually comes from, drop a comment below. I want to know what surprised you most. The Shell LLC thing, the power contracts, the water trade secret argument? Because every time I talk to people about this stuff, the thing that lands hardest is different for everyone. And honestly, your answers help me figure out which of these threads to pull on next. If you haven't subscribed yet, this channel is where I go deep on the business mechanics behind industries that look simple from the outside and turn out to be anything but. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. So let's bring this back to where we started. You wanted to own a data center. You pictured land, servers, revenue. The reality is, you buy the land under a fake company name specifically, so nobody knows who's buying it. You sign a non-cancelable multi-year power contract before construction starts, and you're waiting years for transformers that are back-ordered through the end of the decade. Your water usage, which rivals that of a small town, is in many places legally protected from public disclosure, even from the elected officials voting to approve your project. And the reason you're hiding the water numbers isn't just PR. It's because the water numbers are a map of your computing infrastructure that your competitors would love to have. The building on the highway with no windows and no signs isn't simple. It's the most deliberately obscured piece of infrastructure in the modern economy. And the fact that it looks boring is, in a very deliberate sense, the whole point. If you want to understand the other side of this, what it actually looks like when communities push back, and what the regulatory landscape is starting to do about it, I've got a video on that coming. Watch this one again if any of the mechanics didn't fully click the first time.